The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable.
This week on Q&A, National Medal of Science laureate S. James Gates, Jr. discusses his life, his education, and his work as Regents Professor in the University System of Maryland, John S. Toll Professor of Physics, and Director of the Center for String and Particle Theory at the University of Maryland.
Dr. Jim Gates, how would you define the word science?
Science is really the method by which humanity acquires its most precise understanding of our home, the universe.
And when did you first get interested in it?
Oh, my story is sort of weird. It actually starts when I was 4 years old. We were living in St. John's, Newfoundland at the time. Dad was a soldier in the U.S. Army. Spent 27 years went in during World War II, and was in the Red Ball Express during the Second World War, rolling across Western Europe supplying General Patton's Third Army. But in the 50s, the U.S. still had Army bases and British possessions from the old Lend-Lease program. So Dad was stationed in St. John's, Newfoundland. One day, my mother took her then 3 children to see a movie. The movie was called Spaceways. It's about space travel. And I only figured this movie out about 3 or 4 years ago because although I'm 62 now, I still have memories, a few memories of what the movie was like. And I've carried these memories my entire life. And so I used them in the web, because that's what great technology is for, to figure out what the movie was. It's Spaceways. Stars a guy by the name of Howard Duff and a lady by the name of Eva Bartok. And when I saw the star, I knew why Mom took me to see the movie. Because you see, my mother had no interest in science and technology. She was an artist. She fired clay, she did macrame, she knitted. And so I always wondered, how did Mom take me to see this movie? Well, Howard Duff was married to Ida Lupino, and Ida Lupino was my mother's favorite star. So it made perfect sense that she'd take us to see the movies. That's my first encounter with science. That evening I tried to come home and explain rockets, I'm told, to my father, who was in the Army, a 4-year-old kid. That's pretty funny. And so I was really attracted. 4 years later, we were living in El Paso, Texas, Fort Bliss. Dad was stationed there. He remembered that his 4-year-old son had gotten excited by rockets. One day he brought home 4 books by an author named Willie Ley on space travel, because we all knew that pretty soon some person was going to go into space. And I read the books and had a personal revelation. I then understood at age 8 that the tiny dots of light in the night sky were places to which one might travel. And I was just excited about this idea. And subconsciously, I think I must have remembered this movie because I knew that science was how you got to go to such places. So at age 8, I decided I wanted to become an astronaut/scientist. A few years later, I was in high school. Well, actually, a few years later, even in elementary school, back in the old days, we didn't have the web when the kids had to do homework. We had these huge things called encyclopedias. Dad bought a set of Encyclopedia Britannica for us. One day I was paging through it, and I came across this really weird thing at the time. It was some kind of arithmetic was the word I was using, because it had equal signs and plus signs. This thing turns out to be one of the great equations of physics, something called the Schrodinger equation. And yet for me, at around age 9 or 10, I was fascinated by this thing. And I wondered, could I ever personally understand the story that it told? And then finally in high school, when I was in 11th grade, I had just in Orlando, Florida, it was a segregated high school, Jones High, over 100 years old now in Orlando. And I had just a fantastic physics teacher, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Freeman. 2 weeks into the course, I knew it was physics I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing if I couldn't be an astronaut.
What was that equation called again?
Schrodinger's equation. It's the equation. So when I think you've met Brian Greene, and he talks about the quantum cafe where all this weird stuff goes on, walking through walls and duplicates come together. That behavior, although we don't see it in our world, that is the world of electrons. And we know that because this equation written by Schrodinger accurately describes how to build cell phones, for example. So that's the equation that sort of hooked me into science.
Your current job?
Well, currently I'm a professor of physics at the University of Maryland. My title is ridiculously long. I'm the Regents Professor of the University System of Maryland, the John S. Toll Professor of Physics, and this Center for String and Particle Theory Director. It's a real mouthful. What it basically means is that those dreams that I had when I was 8 and 14, it means they all came true.
Here's a video clip, because there are a lot of them on the web with you, talking about something that I want you to define for a generalist like me. Let's
Very
watch.
good.
How do you feel about describing your science in 30 seconds?
I'm going to make the attempt. Imagine that you had a yardstick. If you cut it into 10 equal pieces and throw away 9, you'll go from something this big to that big. Take that remaining thing, cut it into 10 equal pieces, throw away 9, keep 1. You go from a yardstick to the size of my fingernail. If you do this process 10 times, you get to the size of the atom. Suppose you did that, say, 35 times. What's left in our universe? Well, we have no instruments to measure that. And so people like me have been working on a piece of mathematics called string theory and superstring theory to answer that question. We think there are filaments there. I tried.
What were we watching?
Well, I was challenged to explain the science I do in 30 seconds. And so this is a part of a program called The Secret Life of Scientists. They have a whole archive of people like me doing this and talking about what we do as people engaged in science. And so that was a challenge, and that's what I delivered.
How can you tell when people like me hear that 30-second definition and haven't got a clue?
Well, actually, what generally happens is people do tend to get something from that because they understand that what we're doing is trying to study the world at its smallest possible scales. The other thing I think is really interesting is my wife is often asked by people who find out I'm a theoretical physicist, what does your husband actually do? And her answer is, he makes up stuff for a living. Now, that's sort of right, but the way I prefer to tell my story is the following. Most people know what novelists do. A novelist takes words and sentences and makes characters and tells stories. Well, a theoretical physicist does the same thing, except that we use mathematics to make up our characters and tell our stories. And then, if we're really good at what we do, our stories correspond to something that happens in nature. So that little clip that you saw a few moments ago was my attempt to sort of boil down to a very 30-second soundbite mode describing what it is that I and people in my community do to try to understand the world.
Did you have to practice that?
We got that taken about 3 or 4 times.
Here's another piece of video that further defines your life. Let's watch.
2011 National Medal of Science to Sylvester James Gates, Jr., University of Maryland, for contributions to the mathematics of supersymmetry in particle, field, and string theories and extraordinary efforts to engage the public on the beauty and wonder of fundamental physics.
How did that happen?
I don't know the complete story because one never knows for these major scientific awards how it gets started. I can tell you generally what happened, which is that someone somewhere decided to nominate me for this award. In fact, that part I do know. Eventually, that day, in fact, I found out that the former president of the University of Maryland campus, a gentleman by the name of Daniel Moat, who served as a magnificent term as our president, he just stepped down about 2 or 3 years ago, was the person who nominated me for that award. The process after the nomination becomes totally opaque. Some set of my colleagues that I'm sure include some of the best physicists in the world were then solicited to provide input on what it was that I had done in my scientific career. This then went to another group of scientists who then evaluate the letters of reference as they come in. And then, you know, there's a group that does an evaluation that says, is this scientist really worthy of receiving this recognition? The National Medal of Science is a unique honor in my life. Most people have heard of the Medal of Honor. because we know that brave soldiers who do extreme acts of bravery defending our country can earn the Medal of Honor. And some people have heard of the Medal of Art. So, for example, they have these beautiful performances in the Kennedy Center for the recipients, and often you see pictures of that on the news. Most people don't know that there's a Medal of Science, which is the comparable medal that our country uses to recognize an individual's contribution to science. And so it was just a dream come true.
Did I hear them say 2011, but you got this in 2013?
Yes. So yes, this was the 2011 award for the medal. It didn't happen to 2013 because in between that time, the White House was slightly distracted with a little thing called an election, and so this ceremony, and I'm sure numbers of other things were put off while they were attending the business of trying to win an election.
What impact has the award had on you?
Oh my goodness. I wish someone had warned me beforehand what the award does. So the ceremony took place at the beginning of February. Since the middle of February till now, I have been in 12 states and 2 countries. And so I've been constantly running since the award, making presentations and receiving invitations to go and talk to people about the science I do, but also some of the public policy, because I actually have 4 careers in this life. And one of them involves public policy. I'm pretty sure that though the award was given for my science, I'm sure that the other parts of my professional activities also contributed to people judging me a worthy recipient. So I tell people I have 4 careers. My first career was actually teaching. This is my 40th consecutive year teaching in the classroom. I have been teaching since 1972, university students, either mathematics or physics. My second career is as a researcher. In 1977, I wrote my PhD thesis. It was the first thesis at MIT on the subject called supersymmetry, which lies at the foundation of superstring theory, something a lot of people have heard. And in fact, in some sense, I prepared myself very well to work in superstring theory, which is part of what I do. My third career is basically in public outreach. I've been featured on 5, 6, 7 video documentaries, mostly on Nova, where I have been asked to talk to non-scientists about what it is that our community does. So one of those programs, of course, was The Elegant Universe with Brian Greene. He's actually invited me to serve on 2 of his programs as one of the expert commentators. And then finally, my fourth career is in public policy. It's very strange because this career didn't come from no place, because I've been involved my entire life in some lesser ways in public policy. But in 2009, 2 quite remarkable things happened within 2 weeks of each other. I was at a conference, and a friend and my secretary called and said, "The governor's office is trying to reach you." And I thought, gee, what could I have done wrong now that the governor wants to talk to me? And it was one of the governor's staff members. And we began a conversation about my perhaps joining the Maryland State Board of Education. The staff member explained to me that the governor of Maryland, Martin O'Malley, had a very deep interest in what we call STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics education, and its interplay with the economic vitality of the state in the future. And you really want kids that are good at this stuff, because the jobs out there in the future look like they're going to use that skill set more than we do now. And so that was one thing. And then the other thing that happened, as I said, within about 2 weeks of that, was a call from Dr. Harold Varmus, a Nobel Prize winner and former head of National Institute of Health. I had known Harold for some time. And in fact, this is a funny story, because I was on my way to India. And I was sitting in the airport in Amsterdam, and at my computer, like I always am when I have a free second. And I got this message from Harold saying, "We need to speak." And I sent back a message, "Well, I'm on my way to India. Let's talk in about a week's time when I get back." I got back to the U.S. I wait for Harold's call. Nothing happens. I said, "Oh, well, whatever it was must have gone away." Then about a week after that, I get another message from Harold saying, "I need to talk to you." And I'm like, "Well, Harold, I've been back a week. I thought we would touch base by now. Let's talk anytime you feel like it." Another week goes by. I don't hear anything. So then I'm on my way to the University of Florida in Gainesville. to give a talk at the physics department there. And in the airport, my mobile phone rings. It's Harold. And Harold says, "Jim, can we talk?" And I'm like, "Harold, we've been trying to talk for a month now. What's been going on?" And he said, "If you were offered an appointment to the U.S. President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, what would be your answer?" My response was, "Harold, you should stop kidding." And then he said he was serious. And it was one of the few times in my life when my knees went weak, because I knew exactly what PCAST was. That's the acronym that we use. And to be called upon to advise the President of the United States in service to one's country, this was just unimagined to me in my life. And so since 2009, I've been an advisor to President Obama on this council of about 20 of us that includes people like Eric Schmidt of Google is a member of the council. Craig Mundy of Microsoft is a member of council. Rick Levin, former president of Yale, is a member. Shirley Jackson, president of RPI, is a member. And it's just an incredible group of people. And we advise the President of the United States on issues having to do with science and technology.
Your parents alive?
I wish they were. My mother actually died when I was 12. It was a very painful experience, but in a very odd way, it contributed to my becoming a scientist. In order to escape the emotional pain of the separation, I retreated into a world of fantasy, reading science fiction and comic books and drawing and creating my own characters and what have you. And so because of this attribute of my personality, I sustained the use of my imagination well into my teenage years. And at the time, I noted that a lot of my friends no longer used their imaginations, but I did. And it turns out that was very important, because to be a theoretical physicist is to utilize one's imagination. So I did the right thing to support that. My dad, who was an incredible man, Dad's left a farm in Alabama when he was about 17 years old, joined the U.S. Army, lying about his age in the process, weighing all of 127 pounds. And I like to tell, I used to tell him after I found out his weight, I said, those 2 pounds sure made a difference, because if he had been 2 pounds lighter, he would not have been inducted into the Army. But because he had made the weight requirement, he joined the U.S. Army, had a 27-year-long career, loved service to this country, just absolutely just was in love with the idea of being a soldier and defending the country. And he was a very industrious guy, very committed to education. In our family, when we were young, the question was never what college, no, whether you would go to college. The question was, what college would you go to? So you never had the option of saying, I don't know if I'm going. And he's the person I think that I have to attribute most to who I am. My mother, as I said, died when we were 12. For about 2 years before her death, he raised 4 children by himself while he was on active duty service. I look back at that and I am simply amazed at how he could manage that. At my mother's funeral, the commanding general of Fort Bliss, which is a training center still in operation, sent his color guard to my mother's funeral. I still have memories of having these soldiers with their flags and honoring my father because of the loss of my mother. So we have a deep tradition of service to this country, and when I received the call to serve on PCAST, I thought, my goodness, what Father would have said about this.
Why did you take an interest in chess at an early age? How old were you? And what's the story about the chess club?
Brian, I can tell you've done some research. So when I was in 7th grade, we had just moved about a half year earlier to the Orlando metropolitan area. My father had remarried. I had a stepmother who had a career as an elementary school teacher, typically teaching 1st, 2nd, and 3rd graders. And we finished 6th grade in my mother's school. She was teaching in Winter Park, Florida at the time. So 7th grade, time to transition. In those days, we didn't have middle school. It was junior high school and high school were sort of all lumped together. So grades 7 through 12 were in this one school called Jones High. And I went there. we were kind of different because Dad had moved around, as is the usual way that Army brat, as we call ourselves, the kind of lifestyle we live. And so, you know, the other kids, we had different accents because, as you can tell, I have kind of a flat accent. That's what happens when you live in a lot of places. But I had to learn to be black. Really interesting experience. We had never been in a situation where there were only other African Americans. We'd always been raised in multi-ethnic, cultural and multicultural environment. So I'm in this school, doing pretty well in school, always was a great student. I wound up being the valedictorian when I graduated. And one day I heard about this other kid that was supposed to be really smart. His name was Philip Dunn. And my friends would say, I bet Philip's smarter than you are. And I'm like, you know, at that age, 13, 14, you walk around with a chip on your shoulder about something if you're a guy. Like, you know, this guy can't be that smart. And so some of our friends, mutual friends, introduced us. And so, you know, we sort of felt each other out in terms of, well, what do you think about the algebra class? I mean, it's really funny, you know. Normally think guys would, you know, who's got the better hook shot or who's got the fastest on the. With me and Philip, it was, so how fast can you get to the answer of this problem? And so we were feeling each other sort of out intellectually and coming to understand that, gee, you know, this guy is actually pretty good. And it's the first time in my life I actually met someone who intellectually I felt, I gotta watch this person. And so he introduced me to this game called chess, which he knew how to play and I didn't. He wiped me off the board for a couple of months. And it was so incredibly frustrating because I'd never been intellectually bested at anything in my life. And eventually, one day while we were playing chess, I beat him. I used what's called a pinning maneuver with a rook, and you set up a certain thing where the piece blocks the rook and then you move it, and then the rook automatically has an influence on the row that it's in. And I won the match, and after that we were pretty equal. In fact, our match just came down to the point where a single pawn could make the difference between who won and lost. We never were rated, but we did have some interesting experiences. So by this intense competition, you know, when you're intensely competing against anything, it draws a crowd. So a group of guys would watch us play this game. They learned how to play chess. We had my physics teacher, Mr. Coney, played chess, and so he sort of taught us some things. And then we had a French teacher who also played chess. And so eventually we formed a chess team. The first time this all-black high school had a chess team. And we were looking to challenge other people. So our teachers contacted some of the other high schools, and as I said, in those days it was tradition. We were still very much in a segregated environment, so we were the only black high school in the city. So the high schools that we could play were predominantly European American students. So we got some matches. We beat everybody we ever played.
What was the reaction?
Surprise. I'll never forget the first time. So in Orlando, as I said, we went to Jones High, the sort of one of the big notable high schools in those days. This is before Disney World, so the Orlando metropolitan area only has about 200,000 people. One of the big high schools in Orlando then was called Edgewater, and Edgewater is still there to this day. And that's where we had our first match. And I remember going to the match and being impressed by the fact that the difference in the facilities, the equipment, the books was just amazing. And our books were typically 2, 3, 5 years falling apart. You know, they had new books, they had swimming pools, all kinds of stuff that we didn't have at our high school. And so that was one sort of shock, because that's when I kind of really came to understand how segregation and discrimination impacted African Americans in this country, as well as our European American fellow citizens, because they were then put in the position of believing things that just aren't true. And this chess match was a perfect example of that. So we sat down to the table. I played the second table. My friend Philip was always first table. I played second table. My youngest brother, who was 4 years younger than I was, played third table. So we sat down. I sat across from a young man, and he started telling me how long he had been playing chess, and it was like 6, 7 years. I'd been playing chess at this point maybe 3 or 4. And so we sat down. I was very cautious in my opening. And then at a certain point I decided that he wasn't that good a player, and I beat him. And as I said, our chess team never lost a match the entire time we played. When we graduated, the team basically disbanded. But remarkably enough, about 2 to 3, maybe 4 years later, maybe some of the underclassmen had been aware of what we were doing, reconstituted the team, and they reprised our record. They also beat all the other schools in the Orlando area.
Here's some video of a writer by the name of Chris Mooney. I want you to watch this, and he talks about science and get you to fill in the blanks. Sure.
It is not just about people not knowing the facts. That doesn't really describe the nature of the problem, although it's lamentable, and though they should certainly have much more factual knowledge. But I think it's just as significant when you consider the place of science in society that scientists today in our culture aren't role models, aren't really looked up to. Something like 44% of Americans in another survey, they could not give a name for a scientific role model. In other words, they're polled and they cannot answer the question. And then among those who do answer the question, guess who the top 3 choices are? They are Bill Gates, Al Gore, and Albert Einstein. And what's noticeable about this group is that they're either not scientists or they're not alive.
What's your take on that?
Well, Chris identifies something that many of us worry about for the United States and its future. I'm a child of the 50s, and so we were raised in the shadow of the Second World War, first of all, and certainly being an Army brat, I was very conscious of the fact that we had a military that had done something just almost miraculous in winning the war. And I also, because of my interest in science, understood that there was a connection between the technological advances that our nation had been able to develop and the fact that we had scientists here capable of leading to those developments. And so my entire generation grew up with that. And then came the space race, where once again we start off fearful, behind. Russia's the first country to orbit an artificial satellite with Sputnik, and then she's the first country to put a man in space with Yuri Gagarin, and all of that's happening. And President Kennedy makes a call to the nation, a challenge, that we, within 10 years, will put a man on the moon. Part of that speech which people tend to forget is that he also, in that same speech, says, and we will choose to do this because it is not easy, but because it is hard. And so he called the nation called to the nation in a deeply American spiritual way to meet a challenge. That challenge involved science and technology. As a nation, we really have not, I think, since then, in the aggregate, called on the country to use its great abilities where science is integral to the public knowledge of the interest, because it turns out it's always integral. I mean, so that list included Bill Gates. Well, Bill Gates was at one point the richest person in the world. How did he get that way? Well, it turns out the web, and Al Gore was involved with the web in some way. All that rests on the foundation of science. And so nowadays we're in a kind of a paradoxical state where much of our economic activity in this country, the economic vitality, the opportunity to live the American dream, are directly tied to science, and yet the general population is little aware of this relationship between the two. So we do have this challenge both in the scientific community as well as in the educational community, in the community of public policymakers and media figures like yourself, to try to make sure that our public is aware of this connection, because if we don't maintain our lead in this sort of understanding, there are possibilities for dire outcomes in the future. Most Americans, for example, are not aware that right now China has a space program. She does. If you go on the web, you can find out about it. She has been making progress in her capacities in space, most recently showing the ability to dock orbiting spacecraft. And she has stated that her goal is to put a human on the moon. I suspect that's going to happen within a decade. And if I were running their program, I'd make sure it was a woman. Because if I wanted to one-up the Americans, I would be the first country to put a woman on the moon. I think this kind of challenge is going to be out there. Another kind of challenge involves the environment. Although it's controversial to talk about climate change and the impact that we humans are having on the ecosystem, in the scientific community, this is not a controversy. The overwhelming majority of scientists agree that we are doing this. How do we fix this? How do we not do something immoral, which is to leave the world worse off for our children and grandchildren? The solution is probably going to involve science.
Why do you think the conservatives are so strongly opposed to the climate change, the whole global warming issue?
Well, I don't think of it in those terms, because I think whenever one gets into this dichotomous argument of liberals versus conservatives, you do both sides a disservice.
Well, let me just tell you why I asked that, because I listen to all kinds of talk shows on the left and the right, but the right talk shows come down very strongly anti-global warming. They're anti the whole subject and the whole idea.
Sure.
But why do you think they are?
From what I can understand of the argument, it's actually because they have concerns about the economic welfare of this country, just like the rest of us. Their concern is that we scientists are doing and saying something that will cause Americans not to have the economic vitality and freedom that we're used to. And so I understand that perfectly well. Being a scientist, unfortunately, I kind of know what the scientific evidence tells me, and if we can certainly choose to do nothing, and in fact that's more or less been what we've done. It will mean that the laws of nature are going to act in such a way that they're going to continue to do what they do. All the evidence is starting to accumulate even more and more that we're going to have an impact on the environment. I find it interesting that one of the most conservative organizations in our society is the Pentagon and the military. They're preparing for global climate change and have been for at least almost a decade. So,
in what way?
Well, for example, if you talk, if you have the opportunity to have some people from the Pentagon talk about the green military, the green Air Force, the green Navy, they're talking about having a smaller carbon impact on the society from the operations of military, having more fuel efficient vehicles, being able to use power more efficiently with electrical storage. The Pentagon has been all over this stuff. This is a message that's not out in our society as a whole. That's a very conservative organization, because their responsibility is the welfare of this country. So conservatives, I don't think, are just against this. It's just that there's a lot of education that has to be done.
The Energy Department is trying on a yearly basis to get attention with the young kids with the Science Bowl.
Yes.
They just completed this year's, but we have some video from last year's, and I'm just going to run a little bit so you can...
Sure.
We need a lot of help in defining what they're talking about.
Okay, fine.
B3. My name is Kennedy Agwamba. I am a senior. My favorite subject is astronomy, and I would like to be a researcher when I grow up.
B2.
My name is Vivek Banerjee. I'm a senior. I guess I like chemistry, and I don't know what I'm going to be.
My name is...
please.
B Captain.
My name is Rain. I'm also a senior, and my favorite subject is Earth Science, and I don't know what I will be either.
B1.
Hi, my name is Danny Bork. My favorite subject is biochemistry, parts of astroparticle physics, and what I want to be when I grow up is, I don't know.
In mass spectrometry, the element bromine is easily identified. Anytime a compound with bromine is put into the spectrometer and subsequently broken up and ionized, two peaks of almost exactly the same intensity and spaced 2 mass units apart always show up on the spectrum. Given that the mass of bromine on the periodic table is 80, what masses would you expect? Interrupt.
B Captain.
79 and 81.
That is correct.
And you know, most high school students haven't got a clue.
Of course, most citizens haven't got a clue.
What is your feeling? Are people born with this kind of ability? I mean, you know you're smart. You knew it at an early age.
Most kids start off knowing they're pretty smart. And the evidence of that we scientists often refer to is when you go into an elementary school at grades 1, 2, 3, 4, as a scientist, and you start talking to kids about the world and telling them about stuff, the enthusiasm, the engagement is just off scale. You do that same thing in, say, grades 8, 10, it's very different. So something is happening in our education process to turn young people's natural curiosity off. This event that you just talked about, together with one other event, constitute what I think of as the Super Bowl of science competitions for young people. The other event, by the way, is the Intel Science Talent Search. Okay. The finalists actually come here every year to Washington, D.C. It's sponsored by an organization that I'm on the board of advisors. It's called the Society for Science and the Public. And the STS competition and this competition, you just see that the kids who survive our educational system are just so fantastic, just so capable of contributing to the future of this country. And it sort of, it causes, in some sense, heartburn, pain, because you know that this small group of kids made it, but we also know that there are far more American kids who could do this too.
When did you first know you were smart?
Well, I can tell you when it really came into my consciousness. I was probably in 9th or 10th grade, and a friend of mine one day asked me a question in school. And so this was actually after Philip and I sort of had our first encounters. I didn't think of that as smartness. I just saw it was just it was a guy thing. You know how guys are always in something competition. But one day, another friend of mine by the name of Glenn asked me a question, and I said, I don't know the answer to that. And he sat back stunned. He said, you know, that's the first time in 3 or 4 years that I've known you that you haven't known the answer to a question. And he said, you know, you are smart. And I thought, well, maybe he's right. That was my response.
How do you define smart?
Well, first of all, it has lots of definitions. I can tell you one way I'm not smart at. If you put me on a basketball court, I will embarrass myself. I am not smart at basketball. Really, what smart to me means is really the capacity to use one's intellectual ability to create new solutions, to find answers to problems in ways that maybe have never occurred before. It's the ability to create. That's, to me, ultimately what smarts are all about.
Where'd you meet your wife?
MIT. Let me talk about my wife for a minute since you asked about her. She is an impressive lady in her own right. She's a medical doctor. She's been in practice in Charles County, Maryland for over 20 years. She's the managing partner and CEO of the business side of the practice that she runs and treats patients. Recently, she's gotten into public medicine. She is now the health officer for Charles County. She's always wanted to do public medicine, so she's doing that now. She plays 3 instruments. I play 0, so I'm not smart at music either.
What are her instruments?
She plays guitar, piano, and clarinet. So she's just incredible. We met at MIT, and it was. I like to tell people it was hate at first sight, because she was actually a student who I had the perception that she had a lot of potential that she wouldn't actually harness. And so I would do these things to try to get her more engaged in class. And I thought I was doing diligent to try to draw a student out. From her point of view, I was picking on her. So at the end of that class, both of us were very happy to see the other walk out of each other's life.
You were the teacher?
I was
professor?
The teacher. Yes, I was a professor.
And you got 3 degrees from MIT?
Yes, I got, in 1973, well, yes, in 1973 I received a bachelor's first in mathematics, a bachelor's in physics, and then in 1977 I received a PhD in physics. The fact that I have 2 bachelor's degrees is an accident. When I came to MIT, I wanted to be a physicist, and I knew that from the time I had left 11th grade that that's really what I wanted to do if I couldn't be an astronaut. I almost became an astronaut, by the way. I had a friend named Ron McNair who did, and maybe we'll be able to explore that. But when I was an undergraduate, my grades were better in mathematics, so I declared myself a math major. I took physics classes because that's what I loved, and it was just sort of following my heart. And when I was a senior, a friend of mine suggested I might be able to get both bachelor's degrees. We went to the physics headquarters at MIT. They looked at the transcript, said, you look just like a physics major, except you've got to do lab courses and an undergraduate thesis in your senior year, and you can get a bachelor's degree. So that's how I wound up with 2 bachelors in about 4 years' time.
Let's not go any farther without talking about Ron McNair, because people will remember the Challenger, and he lost his life. How well did you know him?
I knew Ron McNair from the year of 1969 to the year of his death. During the summer of 1969, before I went to MIT, there was a summer program there that I was invited to participate. It was a transitional program. called Project Interface, and it was the most challenging intellectual thing I had ever done at that point. But one of the things that we did that summer, there were a group of us, so we have a stipend, you know, we're all a bunch of poor students, so we're looking for ways to save money. And one of the ways that we did is a couple of us formed what we called a food co-op. We would pitch our little money together, and there was a young lady in the group, and she would cook the food. And so we would go into Boston to Faneuil Hall and the Faneuil Market and buy fresh vegetables and what have you. And that's how I first met Ron, because he was part of our little food co-op in '69. So that's when I first met him. We attended MIT as graduate students together from the period of 1973 to 1977. In '73, I was very surprised to see he had returned to MIT, because he had actually done his undergraduate work at a historically black college in Carolina. And we met back and became great friends, taking lots of classes together. But we truly bonded over something called a general examination. In order to get one's PhD, it is the standard practice that there's a kind of final exam that the university or department will administer that acts as a go, no-go signature. So it's called the general exam at MIT. It's a 5-hour written exam on one day for part one, then there's a 5-hour written exam for part two, and then there's an oral examination. So you have to successfully do all of this, demonstrating to your faculty that you've actually mastered the content of a graduate student, and you are prepared then to go on to write your PhD thesis. So Ron and I tried to take this exam, and we were both unsuccessful on our first attempt. I was amazed, because at that point I questioned whether I'd get to this lifelong dream of becoming a physicist. Ron, although I at the point was also in love with the idea of being a physicist. And Ron and I concluded that maybe if we worked together, we'd have a better shot at it on the second time. So in the entire month of January of 1975, we studied together. It was the first time in my life that I actually did study with someone else. Before then, in doing homework, it had always been I had sort of a lone wolf. I go to my corner, do my work, and get it done, and come back and get pretty good grades, feeling pretty good about myself. It was clear that I had to learn to be more collaborative. And this interaction with Ron taught me lots of really interesting things. One of the things is the power of having more than one mind attack a problem, which I had no appreciation of before then. It also taught me that a problem usually has several alternative solutions. And one of the things that I really took away from the relationship is I learned how to do what I call simulate a second voice in my thinking. So when I'm thinking about a problem, I now say, okay, so this is what you think about it from this point of view. What other possible point of view might there be for you to get to a solution? So I got that from my interaction with Ron. So we studied together, and eventually we both passed the qualifying examination, and we were then both permitted to proceed with our writing of our respective theses.
Where were you the day that the Challenger blew up?
So I was a professor at the University of Maryland on the day that the Challenger exploded. And of course, it's one of those days personally that is similar to what a lot of people say about the death of Kennedy. I know exactly where I was when I heard the news. So for me, this was one of those days. Of course, I also remember exactly where I was when I heard that President Kennedy had been assassinated. So I was a professor at the University of Maryland. I had walked into a bank, because we had a bank on campus. And I was standing in line to get to the teller, and a young woman ran into the room and shouted, "The shuttle exploded." A bunch of students started laughing because we have a bus system on the campus that's called the shuttle, and they're always breaking down. So people thought she was making a joke about another one of the shuttles stopped working. And then a look of horror came over her face, and she said, "No, the real shuttle blew up." And when she said that instant, I realized I had lost a friend. I had seen Ron about 6 months before his death. We had had a roast for him back at MIT. And it was really interesting because he and I talked about our earlier experiences of studying for the general examination. I talked about the fact that when Ron almost always beat me to the answer by very different methods. And so, you know, I said, you know, he had access to some kind of incantations or spells to get the answers. And his response was, oh, no, Jim was just slow, because he always wanted to start off with the Green's function, which is a certain mathematical technique for finding answers. So we had a great time at the roast. And about a week before he died, we saw the TV news about he and the teacher astronaut and all of them about to go up. And then on the day of the explosion, I was stunned. I had a friend that I had worked with at Caltech as a postdoc who was also at Maryland with me, a gentleman by the name of Warren Siegel, who's also, you know, obviously a theoretical physicist. And Warren let me sit in his office and tell Ron stories all day. That was the way I emotionally processed the loss of a friend. A year or so later, there was a ceremony at MIT dedicating a building to Ron's memory. So there is a McNair building at MIT. And a year or so after that, a very odd occurrence in my life happened. I was in a bookstore, and I was walking by a book, and it fell on the floor. And I don't remember actually touching it. I have no recollection, but it fell on the floor, and it was open. And as I picked it up, I saw my name on the page, and I thought, you know, what is this? And so I read a little bit. In this book, the author had relayed the story of the dedication of the McNair building at MIT, and the book was basically about the African Americans who had been among the first astronauts, including some that never had an opportunity to fly. And I immediately bought the book.
Why did you not pursue your possible dream of being an astronaut?
Because NASA told me I had the wrong stuff. So in 1979, I was a postdoc at Harvard University. I had left MIT, got my PhD, was doing I work in a very strange mathematical area called supergravity. I and my friend Warren Siegel, in fact, were working together on it, and we had developed some things that no one in the world understood. You know, it's really exciting to be a young person saying, I'm doing something no one's ever done in math, and it's physics, and we were just having a great time. And so I was ending my 3-year appointment at Harvard, and I had actually gotten a second appointment at Caltech by then, so I was looking forward to going to Caltech, working with John Schwartz, Murray Gell-Mann, Dick Feynman, and I have my own personal Feynman stories because of this. But so I got this call from Ron saying, NASA's going to open up another round of applications for people who want to be astronauts. And he says, I know you. We've talked about this. You should apply. And so I had some debates, but I did. I applied. And they had, I'm told they had about 3,000 people in that round of applications. And they successfully cut the pools down to smaller and smaller sizes. And then when they got to a remaining group of about 120, they invited the candidates to come down to the Johnson Space Flight Center for psychological and physical evaluation. And so to my very great surprise, because I thought, you know, look, I'm not a super athlete, I'm pretty good at school stuff, and you know, I have this kind of manic part of my personality that when I do something, I'm gonna do my best to get it as good as possible. But I hadn't thought that they would really look closely at me, but they did. So we went down and spent a week at the Johnson Clear Lake facility. Put you inside of boxes and spun you around, and had some psychological evaluation. I tell people that I had a psychiatrist actually ask me if I loved my mother, which to me I thought only happened in the movies. I couldn't imagine it happened in real life. But the most interesting part of that week's visit was while I was there on campus, I bumped into Ron, who didn't know I was there. He didn't know I had made it that far in the selection process. And so we're both walking down the street, and there's Ron. I'm like, Ron, I didn't know you were here. He said, you've made it this far? I'm like, yeah. He said, well, let me go take you and introduce you to some friends. So we went over to where the astronauts, the real astronauts were, their offices. And I met Colonel Fred Gregory, the first African American to pilot the shuttle. I met Guy Bluford, and I met Charlie Bolden, the current administrator at NASA. So I met them all on that day. And then a few weeks later, I got a call from an official at NASA. And I was still living in just right down the street from Harvard at the time. And he said, Jim, you presented a great case for yourself, but I'm sorry, you were not selected as a finalist. At which point, I started sort of laughing. Now, I'm sure that the person at the other end thought, gee, this guy's gone hysterical and lost it. But what he didn't know was that if they had said yes, I would have been faced with then the greatest quandary in my life. The quandary would have been, do I continue to pursue my career as a scientist working with people like Richard Feynman and Murray Gell-Mann and John Schwartz being the inventor of string theory? Do I do that? Or do I pursue this other part of my childhood dream to become an astronaut? How do you make that decision? I would have dreaded that. So when they made the decision for me by saying no, and effectively, like I said, NASA told me I had the wrong stuff, then I didn't have to make the decision anymore. It was all set, and I was very happy to pursue that line of possibilities. And so I just started laughing here, you know, just with great hilarity on the phone call.
Here is a story you told about a flight to South Africa. Let's watch.
So I was trying to make my way to this window seat on this occasion, and this gentleman saw me approaching, and he looked up and he smiled, this brilliant smile. And he said, "Is this your seat?" with a slight Afrikaans accent. And I said, "Yes, that's mine." He said, "Here, let me move out of the way." So he jumped up, and I had some bags to put up in the overhead, and he was helpful with me getting the bags up. And I thought, God. Now, this was not my first visit in South Africa, but I thought this is one of the most helpful, friendly South Africans I've ever met. And so I said, "Oh, are you a fan of science?" He said, "No." And so at this point, I'm like, "Well, where did you actually see me?" He said, "Oh, come on. All of us have seen Invictus." And then I had a hard time convincing him that I am not Morgan Freeman.
Has that ever happened before or after?
Brian, you're not going to believe this, but it has happened within the last month, and then certainly in the last 2 months, 3 different times. The most recent time was about 2 weeks ago. I was on an airplane, and I had to come back from the lavatory, and I was coming to my seat, and I sat down, and the young man in front of me turned around and said, "You know, Shawshank Redemption is my favorite movie." And I said, "And you're telling me this, why?" And he says, "Well, you're Morgan Freeman, of course." And I said, "No, I'm not Morgan Freeman." I was in South Africa about a month ago, and I was at JFK having to make a connection. And there was a young couple, it was morning, I wanted to get a croissant for breakfast, and I was standing in line. There was this young couple in front of me, and I noticed the young man looking back at me, and I didn't think very much about it. And then they got their order and paid for it and moved to the side, and then then I moved up and told the young woman I wanted a chocolate croissant and some orange juice. And then at that point he turned to me and said, "Oh, you're not Morgan Freeman." He said, "Until I heard your voice, I thought you might be." So I keep telling people I'm not Morgan Freeman. This has been going on since 2005, and it leads to all kinds of funny events. One of the most memorable, perhaps, did occur in South Africa. One evening, I was in a restaurant with a group of friends. We had gone out to an outdoor cafe. We were having a wonderful time. And at one point, I noticed the people at the adjacent tables turning to look at our table, and I thought, gee, that's rather odd. And then I noticed the wait staff starting to turn and look at our table, and I said, gee, you know, what's going on? And then you could see some of the chefs coming out to the door, leaning out, looking at our table, and I'm like, what's this about? So finally the head waiter comes over and leans down and in a very sotto voce voice says, "Sir, are you Morgan Freeman?" And my friend, who's one of my Afrikaans friends who was sitting to my right, pipes in, "Yes, he is, but he doesn't want anybody to know." We had a great meal that night.
But why hasn't somebody said, "Are you Nelson Mandela?" The part that he played.
Yeah, you know, I don't know. I'll tell you, I'm actually hopeful to meet Morgan Freeman. Well, I've been to South Africa many times, and I have always wanted to meet Nelson Mandela, but I don't think I'm going to ever have that opportunity. But, you know, we followed the reports on his health.
Here's your friend Brian Greene at Columbia.
Because all of the scientific work that we're involved with has to be funded. And of course, there are limited funds. What do you spend your money on? So for instance, we were building a machine in Texas called the Superconducting Super Collider in the early 1990s. And that was meant to be a huge atom smasher, a huge tunnel in which particles would slam together at high energies, recreating events unseen since the Big Bang. And that was a very expensive undertaking, and it was ultimately canceled because budgetary constraints wouldn't allow it to go forward. This was a big blow to science. So there you see that the intersection of the work that we're doing with public policy can have a great impact on the rate of progress.
Super Collider, what does it do?
What would it have done? Because
I'm thinking of the one in Europe.
The LHC, the Large Hadron Collider. So what does it do? Well, we take protons and use electrical fields, basically radio signals, to pump energy into them, and that causes them to move. In fact, the protons that are accelerated at the LHC are moving at 0.9999999 the speed of light. Humans have never made anything move this fast before, so it's almost at the speed of light. So we put them in magnetic fields, which then cause them to rotate in circular paths, and then they're actually rotating there in two separate pipes, and the pipes have the air pumped out of them because we don't want them bumping into air molecules. You want a pure beam. And then you let these two pipes open up into each other so that you can allow the protons to crash into each other. And at those points, we Americans have done something incredible. There are two, I like to tell people they're big iPhones. There are these devices called detectors. One of them is called the Compact Muon Solenoid, the CMS. The other one is the Atlas detectors. Both of these devices represent over several thousand U.S. physicists working in Geneva, Switzerland, as well as several $100 million U.S. dollars. I remember in 1998, I was in the White House and I met President Clinton. And this was just after the Super Collider in Texas, the one that Brian spoke about, had been canceled. And, you know, it was a great tragedy, especially as we look backwards. So you talk about cost. The cost is about maybe 3 to 4 B-2 bombers. That's what basically doomed the project. In some sense, the Super Collider wound up being perceived by our policymakers as being a choice between the Super Collider and the space station. And so the space station was the way that the country chose to go. The Super Collider, which would have been 3 times as powerful as the LHC that operates right now, 3 times, would have found the same physics. We would have been there over a decade ago, so the rate of progress that Brian was talking about in your video, we would have done these discoveries over a decade ago.
Where can people find, I know I saw a lot on the web, but what would you recommend that where you're talking science, you've done a lot?
Yes. Well, the project that I've done most complete discussion is something called Superstring Theory, the DNA of Reality. It's a commercial project with the teaching company. People can go to the website, and I've actually tried to talk about all the physics in this thing.
So the teaching company sells
videos
and audios of you talking about the string theory.
Yes, the only video.
We have not talked much about science. We've talked about you and your background, and people can find you at Maryland in the classroom still?
I'm still teaching that. So going to year 41 teaching.
What year of students do you teach?
I teach at all levels. Right now I'm actually teaching 2nd and 3rd year undergraduates.
Dr. Sylvester James Gates, professor at University of Maryland, a Regents professor, which there are only a few of those.
Only 6 in the history of the entire system.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. It was a great opportunity to speak with you and your audience.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at Q&A.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.